We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now your host for the Millennial Roundtable, Chelsey Youman.
Well, welcome to the Millennial Roundtable on this beautiful Thursday afternoon. I am so excited to be joining you today with, of course, as always, a full show. I feel like we have more news to cover than ever before, really. But joining us this first and second hour is going to be Liberty McArtor. You know her well. She's a Point of View writer. She is the host of the podcast Know Why, and the president of that podcast. We're going to cover a little bit of what she's been talking about on that show today. So thanks for coming over and joining us today, Liberty.
Yeah, happy to be here, Chelsey.
So glad to have you with us. Of course, joining us the second hour is going to be Alyssa Sonnenburg. She's going to join us as we discuss in that second hour some world news related to Gaza. There's a lot to talk about, as well as this most recent Russian peace deal between President Trump that he's negotiating with Ukraine and Russia. But in this first hour, we're going to cover a little bit of pro-life news as well as Christian news from around the world out of Syria. Some really devastating news coming from the massacres that are happening there. But I'm going to start with IVF as our first issue. Of course, you can go to pointofview.org and look up our articles today. And we're going to start diving right in right now. So thanks for being with us again, Liberty. We're going to start on really what has been an increasing trend among Republican and GOP lawmakers over the last 2 years in supporting and expanding taxpayer-funded IVF, insurance-covered IVF, and all sorts of things through their legislative and policy processes. And of course, right now in the spring, we are in the middle of your state sessions are in order, where your lawmakers are at your state capitals, trying to pass as many bills and policies as they can. And of course, we have Congress in session right now. And so it's just an active time to cover this issue. I was a little bit surprised, Liberty, when I saw really who is owning the IVF expansion trend. Did it surprise you to see that the Republicans and the GOP lawmakers are really taking the helm on this issue?
I don't know, Chelsey. Maybe I need to be a little more just aware of kind of the background. I feel like for a long time, the IVF issue has kind of flown under the radar for a lot of conservatives and even Christian pro-lifers who maybe they identify as pro-life, but they aren't really into the issue. They don't generally do a lot of research into the issue, because I know for a lot of people, it seems like, hey, someone's having fertility problems. This is a way for them to have a child. Shouldn't pro-lifers support that? But obviously, as this article, details, is there are so many ethical issues with the IVF industry and with the way that it can be done. And so I feel like pro-lifers are starting to be more vocal about this. I know some people have been vocal for a long time, but I think maybe there needs to be more education on this topic, or maybe it's just the fact that Republican politicians think they can't win if they are both against abortion and against IVF. But I don't know. It is a little bit confusing to me.
Yeah, we're going to get into all of this, the ethical considerations, because I do think it's a topic that can be scientifically or medically heavy. There's nuance. We don't always know all the statistics. It's a private industry. It's a very unregulated industry. So the data is not always as readily available as maybe other aspects of healthcare industries is. So let's start, though, with, I'm going to say how we got here politically. Beginning in 2024, so we all can remember, of course, the Dobbs decision being rendered and the pro-life states, pro-life laws all being enacted and enforceable for the first time in over 50 years once Roe was overturned. In the midst of all of that media, I'll call it a media firestorm, legal firestorm, all of those things, there were a lot of really intense, negative, I would even say some headlines were just straight propaganda for the abortion industry. And in the mix of all of that, there was a case you guys may or may not remember coming out of Alabama. And I'm going to say what happened in this case because it is, at its core, it's something that I think every single American would empathize with the couple over. And it's not about, politics or being pro-life or how you feel about abortion. It's just a human issue. And so in that case out of Alabama, one of, again, a deeply unregulated industry, one of the IVF treatment facilities that was housing and storing, I think it was a hospital, freezers of embryos, human-created embryos, so not an egg separated from the sperm, but a human that was created, an actual embryo ready to be implanted, where they were freezing all of those. Someone went in and there was an accident and dropped several of the Petri dishes of embryos, and they were killed. Those children died. And so the parents, devastated, tragically lost these children they had created and wanted to have, sued the facility and essentially said, these were our children. We lost them, and there should have been better security protocols, safety protocols. And the judge in that case said these embryos were, in fact, human children. They were alive and frozen. And that started, Liberty, do you remember this giant media firestorm where none of those facts were really reported on widely, and instead it became, pro-life judge is coming for the IVF industry and says embryos are humans. And if you recall, Liberty, the IVF industry responded equally and said, well, we're going to slow down our processes. If these children were created are actually considered children, then we have an actual duty and responsibility ethically to protect them. They shut down. A lot of them slowed their processes, which added to the firestorm. Do you remember any of that? And I'd love your commentary on it.
Oh, yeah. I remember all of a sudden, it became very hot button issue. And I think this brought the whole issue of IVF to the forefront of people's minds even more, because all of a sudden more people were considering like the ethical pro-life implications. And if you have an industry that is saying, oh, well, if these are human beings, we better be more careful, that should make you question what the industry was doing to begin with. And so I think that it opened a lot of people's eyes. I think a lot of people naturally got or understandably got very defensive of it because maybe they had used it or they knew people who had used IVF and they felt like, oh no, this is being attacked. But I think a lot of people also began to realize, oh, hey, there are some really big concerns with how the industry operates and how we are treating these human beings in their earliest stages of life.
Right. That's something I think we could all agree on, Liberty, is the entire point of going through fertility treatment and IVF is because a loving father and a loving mother or same-sex marriage couples do this as well, desire to have a child. And the industry helping them create that child should treat it like a child, right? That's the entire purpose of all of it. And so if we remember what happened after that, we're about to go to break, but what happened after that was what I would call an overcorrection by Republicans. And so this, when we're looking at, how we got here, it's important to think of, the legal landscape, the media landscape, and the political landscape all coinciding at this one moment in time where it was one thing to say you were pro-life and hold deeply sincere beliefs on the value and dignity of a human child created in the womb in the image of God, knit together in the womb. It's one thing to stand by those convictions. It's another thing when they start to say you're anti-IVF. We're going to continue the story more after this short break.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Natasha Crane warns Christians in her new book, When Culture Hates You, Persevering for the Common Good as Christians in a Hostile Public Square. She begins by talking about the hostility Christians often face when they articulate a biblical perspective on cultural issues. Now, we shouldn't be surprised, since Jesus warned us that if the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. One of the most significant criticisms from non-Christians, and even from Christians as well, is that Christians should not impose their views on others. We also hear that Christians should not seek power. We're told that getting involved in politics harms our witness and can disrupt unity in the church. And we're told that Christians should not be partisans. Well, to evaluate those objections, she proposes slavery as a test case. Here are her 5 key statements using those objections. Number 1, Christians shouldn't have worked to end slavery because we shouldn't have imposed our views on others. Number 2, Christians shouldn't have worked to end slavery because that involves seeking power to do it. Number 3, Christians shouldn't have worked to end slavery because getting involved with a political issue harmed our witness. Number 4, Christians shouldn't have worked to end slavery because it disrupted unity in the church. And number 5, Christians shouldn't have worked to end slavery because Christians shouldn't have been partisans. Now, would we accept those objections today? We should reject such reasoning and can see how we shouldn't have applied such arguments 2 centuries ago. We were called to speak truth then, and we're called to speak truth today. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back to the Millennial Roundtable, where Liberty and I are talking, I think, Liberty, maybe for the first time, about the IVF industry and a growing trend, or at least bill filings and legislative filings involving expanding access, payment for taxpayer-funded IVF treatments. And we really broke down just a minute ago, so don't forget to go back and listen if you're just now joining, how we think this trend got started, first being with the lawsuit that came at really this pinnacle of time right after Roe was overturned, where an Alabama Supreme Court decided that embryos that are, in fact, what they are, children who are created, and they are human and they are alive and worth protecting, and that the IVF centers who are housing them and freezing them have a duty to in fact protect them and safeguard them from destruction and accidents, which is what happened in that case. Well, what proceeded from there, and we're just now getting into this part, Liberty, is politically there was a giant media and political backlash where Republicans in the headlines were being, essentially this narrative started, I'm going to call it fake news, that, well, because this case said that embryos are human children, which is the entire purpose of creating an embryo in a laboratory, is to create a human child, that the pro-life industry and all these pro-life Republicans were also anti-IVF. And that's not true, is it, Liberty? I think the truth is that, as you mentioned, many of these pro-lifers don't know that much about the industry practices and are for fertility treatments, right or wrong. And then I want to get into the ethics of it, Liberty.
Yeah, I mean, I know people who have used or have considered, IVF. And so I know that it is a sensitive topic for a lot of people, especially when you have parents who want a child so badly and they are willing to try to do, whatever they can to have a biological child. And so, as always, the pro-abortion media and the abortion industry is going to try to paint pro-lifers in the worst light possible. And so it was just a very, like, as you described, and I really appreciate how you've connected these dots from, this court case that happened in Alabama to kind of the political reaction and the media reaction. Many people took advantage of just another way to cast pro-lifers in a bad light instead of taking the opportunity, which I think many pro-life organizations are trying to do now, to have a nuanced discussion of the issue. It's not that pro-lifers are against fertility treatments or even against IVF done ethically, but that if we really do, this whole case really brought to the forefront a lot of the potential concerns with the industry and with the ethics involved and how these embryos are being treated. And so really, the pro-lifers care about unborn lives. They care about human lives. And so if this is an industry that is creating human life, it needs to be talked about carefully and seriously. You can't, really go into these extremes on both sides. But of course, that's what the media headlines will do.
Exactly. You're right. It's with anything, there's nuance. And I think what happened in that scenario is IVF, we all know, it's increasing. It's culturally popular. And as you mentioned, we're not having a lot of the discussions, I think, in our living rooms or around our kitchen tables about the ethical implications of IVF. And so when Republicans were so heavily criticized, I know in the political circles I'm in, it was discussed, we're going to lose huge if we continue to be painted as anti-IVF. And so I'm going to say there was an overcorrection on the part of the Republicans to own this issue. We're so pro-family that we're going to pay for IVF, insurance has to cover IVF and fertility treatments and all these things. I think it's okay to say we don't need to overreact. I think that it's okay to be politically unpopular or culturally unpopular if you're standing for the right thing, which is the protection and of dignity of humans. And so this article on pointofview.net, I think, had some really great quotes and outstanding statistics if you are interested in learning more about what does go on when there's fertility treatments. First, I'm going to say that my heart goes out to so many couples who I believe it's now like 1 in 4 couples struggling with infertility. It's such a difficult, long journey, and to trust the Lord through that process if you're a believer. And if you're not a believer, I can't even imagine, because, it's just so difficult. And infertility rates are increasing. I think the last estimate I saw was about 1% annually, which is a huge. So I think the first question to ask is, Liberty, why are infertility challenges increasing at such high rates? Students for Life has done a really great job researching our water, and surprise, surprise, it could have to do with, it doesn't, it's not that it could, they're connecting the dots with their studies that abortion drugs have 3 active enzymes that are in our water system, particularly in large urban areas and centers. But beyond that, Liberty, let's get into the ethical considerations of IVF, because in this article, the leading voice in this article is a man named John Speed, who's trying to educate more. He's very pro-life on IVF practices. And one of the things he says is that for every 1 child that is born through IVF treatments, I think it's between, 25 to 30 human embryos are destroyed for every 1 live birth. That was news to me. Was that news to you, Liberty?
Yes. I mean, I know the basics of the process where typically multiple embryos are created. And not all are implanted. But for a dozen embryos die or discarded or frozen for every baby born through IVF. And that in 1 year, 1.3 million embryos went unaccounted for in the IVF industry. And that's just mind-blowing. I did not know that it was that drastic. I didn't know that 1.3 million embryos a year are unaccounted for. That's mass casualty, is what we're talking about. And so it's important to know it's without, judgment or blame on any couple who walks through this path, just the ethical care that needs to be taken. One other ethical concern I've seen as an attorney who advised a Catholic fertility treatment center, who, by the way, was one of the first IVF treatment centers in the entire state of Texas. And they were run by Catholics because they want to see, parents and large families. And we were helping them through their ethical guidelines and trying not to get sued, by same-sex married couples who were coming to them demanding that, they get embryos. At the same time, you would see in the contracts things like for a surrogate, for instance, some
people will include in that contract abortion clauses if the child ends up having a fetal abnormality or is unhealthy for any reason or gets a diagnosis, that they can, in fact, force the surrogate to have an abortion. So there's another ethical consideration is what's going on in the contracts themselves. And then just, the difficulty of what I can only call or refer to as commoditizing a human. When you've heard of the genetic selection that goes into this, maybe, where do you want your child to have blue eyes or brown eyes? Those genetics, that DNA selection is getting more and more refined over time. The technology is better. And when you have you don't want to end up with designer humans where we're playing God. It goes so much further than helping a couple get a child. Then you're getting into genetic selection and human selection, right?
Yeah. I mean, the first, concern is what, if multiple embryos are created, what happens to the ones that are not implanted? And a lot of times they are kind of in this, eternal limbo, either discarded or just put in a freezer for later. And not all couples and not all doctors do it that way, but a large portion of the industry does. And then, like you said, the selection, because, I think, according to my understanding, what is typical is to create many embryos with the intent of selecting the, healthiest or best one. And as you said, the selection process is getting more and more refined. So parents can really choose, which embryo they're going to keep. And if we don't believe that we should abort children because of, problems that they may have that we detect in utero, or disabilities that they may have, then we shouldn't be weeding out, creating embryos just to weed them out and then select the best one. Again, that, like you said, commodifies human beings. And as Christians, that's not how we should handle human life.
Exactly. There's so much to break down ethically here, but at the end of the day, I think my broader point would be if policymakers or lawmakers want to expand access to fertility treatments for struggling couples and have government pay for it, insurance pay for it, and all of that, it might also be good to balance those policies out with ethical regulations of the industry and say you have a duty not to produce mass casualty events when it comes to these embryos, to protect them, to secure the facilities. You hear the frozen embryos that are stuck for decades. There's a duty of care here for what you're creating, who you're creating, and that's what I would advocate for more after this short break.
If you appreciate the trustworthy news and biblical worldview that you hear on Point of View, would you consider joining our team, the Truth Team? Listeners like you have been the backbone of Point of View for 53 years. But today there are more voices competing for Americans' attention than ever before, and few of them are anchored to biblical truth. By joining Point of View's Truth Team, you can be an integral part of keeping truth on the air. In just a few weeks, Point of View will celebrate Truth Team Week. But you don't have to wait till then. You can join the Truth Team right now and help us get a head start on our $150,000 spring fundraising goal. If you appreciate Point of View, please join the Truth Team. Join today by visiting us online at pointofview.net. Or you can call toll-free 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, Chelsey Youman.
Welcome back to the Millennial Roundtable. I'm so excited to be joined today by Liberty McArtor. First, because she's such a brilliant mind and always brings such a fresh perspective to all the issues and news we're talking about, but also because she is the president and host of the Know Why podcast, which I want to give you, Liberty, a minute to talk about today, because we're going to discuss a topic that you covered on your podcast, which I think is so important. I wanted to make sure to bring it here today. So go ahead and tell us a little bit about your podcast, Liberty, and then we'll dive into our next topic.
Thanks, Chelsey. You can find more information at knowwhypodcast.com. But we release weekly episodes that you can find anywhere you listen to podcasts, and we're on YouTube now, so you can find Know Why Podcast at YouTube. But the goal is to really reach younger generations, so millennials like me, Gen Z, because there are a lot of apologetics organizations that are focused on high school, even college. Once you become an adult, I think, speaking in broad terms, Christian ministries often kind of siphon people into, parenthood ministry or marriage ministry and things like that. And so, but what about people who maybe still just have questions about their faith? They still have questions. Maybe they're kind of deconstructing, or they just want to know why they believe what they believe or why they were taught certain things. And so we really try to address the tough questions, things that matter most in life, and just have it be an open environment where people don't feel bad about maybe being skeptical or asking those questions, but we dive into evidence that is just, it's so amazing, because when you do look at research on a wide range of issues, it points back to the truth of God's word.
I love that. So well said. Well, if you haven't already, go to your podcast app and pull up the Know Why podcast, where you can subscribe and listen to Liberty there. One of the recent topics you discussed is one on the show that I'm so passionate about, and I know that Point of View is so passionate about, which is deciphering between truth in our society, in a society where we have access to almost unlimited, almost too much access to information, which just you can pull up your phone between AI and Google or your social media, and everybody can basically define whatever reality they want. You can find an article or information out there to support whatever view you have on either side, and almost create this silo of information in your feed where you are getting the information you agree with, want to, and sometimes that information is educational. Sometimes that information can be propaganda. Sometimes that information can be indoctrinating. And so in a world where we are committed to deciphering truth from lies, objectivity from subjectivity, where we want to reject relativism and say we can't just create our own realities here. There is a truth, there's an up and a down, a left and a right. How do we do that? And Liberty, your most recent podcast really dove right in. So I would love for you to help us, give us some guideposts into navigating when we're seeing, whether it's news headlines is where I tend to gravitate, because I think they can be so much propaganda there. The difference between education, indoctrination, and propaganda. Oh,
sure. Well, I have to give a shout out to producer Steve Miller of Point of View, because he actually showed me this article. And so if you go to knowwhypodcast.com and look at the episode on Why Am I Still a Christian, it's actually linked there so you can find it too. But it was so good because, like you said, there's so much information, and I think a lot of people want to think critically, and they are starting to question what they hear, whether that's from the media or maybe it's what they were taught whenever they were growing up. But how do we do that? How do we discern what's true when we're trying to think critically? And a lot of it goes down to just identifying like what's propaganda versus what's education. And one of the biggest things is education emphasizes how to think instead of what to think. If somebody is truly interested in helping you develop your mind and your opinions and your critical thinking skills as a human, then they will not only feed you one side of the story. they would truly be, and this kind of even goes back to the free marketplace of ideas, right? Where we shouldn't be afraid to expose people to multiple opinions, but we need to teach people how to weigh those opinions or weigh those different worldviews. If somebody is shutting you down when you ask questions, or there is a media outlet that will not report on maybe an alternative viewpoint, then that's propaganda, because they are scared of you asking questions or learning about a different worldview. And sometimes places or individuals or people or movements, they will try to make it look like they're being fair by saying, here's what the other side teaches, and we're going to show why that's wrong. But what they're really doing is attacking straw men. And so if you want to truly educate people and respect their thinking and their development of their own mind, then you have to fairly represent what the opposite side believes, even if you disagree with it. Because then once you fairly represent what they actually believe, then you can address it with your own arguments. So an education will examine both sides instead of just one side. Education will review pros and cons of two sides of an issue. And it's okay, again, to still advocate for your own worldview, but you can't limit what people are being told or what information they receive. You need to be willing to really help people think through various different worldviews and arguments, because that's going to help them be a better thinker overall. So those are some of the main points, but I just thought they were so helpful.
That is such a helpful checklist, and I want to just be the first to raise my hand and say that both sides can be guilty of propaganda, and so in the pursuit of education, in the pursuit of understanding facts over commentary, I love your checklist here, because this is going to include the next 4 years. Even under President Trump's administration, we're getting so much information so fast. He's moving at warp speed on so many issues. And it's good to slow down a little bit, isn't it, and say, all right, wait a minute. And is what I'm being fed, even by those I agree with, really blurring the lines between education, information, and indoctrination or propaganda? And so on your checklist, I heard one is education encourages critical thinking, which of course says we're going to give you facts and you're going to get to draw your own conclusions from those facts. So, for instance, whether or not, this is a huge one, whether or not you're going to take the COVID vaccine, for instance, the facts are, at the time it was that it would help maybe soften the blow of COVID for you, but it wouldn't help prevent you from getting it to begin with, or from giving it to others, right? So there were facts there, and then it's on you as an individual to draw your own conclusions about what you want to do about those facts. That would be an educational way to present it. Propaganda was the $100 billion marketing machine that came up against everybody to pressure them into getting the vaccine. The other would be, like I said, objective presentation of those facts, allowing, you mentioned disagreements or multiple sides. So if you see a headline, really dig under and see, are both sides presented? This is something, when I do a lot of media in the pro-life space for Human Coalition, I can't tell you how many dozens and dozens of interviews I've done, and they didn't really like what I had to say, so I didn't get quoted. And maybe in the article, they'll put in a couple quotes from somebody on your side, but they're not really delving into the heart of the issues. And so I would say thinking deeper is, in addition to whether there are two sides presented, are the sides presented fairly? Are they presented with the facts on both sides to allow you to have that critical thinking? And then the one that I highlighted, and I think you also mentioned this, is honesty over deception. And so are we muddying the waters? Are we really telling the truth? We talked about in the IVF case in the last segment, so go back and listen on pointofview.net or on Facebook on Point of View Radio. We talked about that case, and I said, well, they talked about the results of the case. They did not talk about the underlying facts of the case. Well, that's deceptive. That's not allowing an honest presentation of objective facts to allow you to draw your own conclusion. It's gonna taint it in one direction or the other. And so I just appreciate you bringing this topic up on your podcast, Liberty, because It's one in our world of increasing information for us to just check ourselves and say, are we living in our own silos where our algorithms know what we like to see, and then we're feeding ourselves our own loop of information that we always agree with, or are we, do we still have those critical thinking skills, right, Liberty?
Absolutely. And it is something that we need to check ourselves too, because if we have passionate beliefs about an issue, naturally we're going to want other people to hold those beliefs too. But we have to still be careful to respect their minds and help them to think through the issues carefully, but make sure that we're really educating and not propagandizing. And ultimately, I think that will be more fruitful for us in the end.
Yes, I love what you're saying. It's a dialogue. Back to our favorite First Amendment rights outside of religious protection. More after the short break.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back to the Millennial Roundtable, where Liberty McArtor and I are now turning our discussion to some world news, really actually some tragic news coming out of Syria. I would say in less than a week, it hasn't even been a full week, that Christians are among over 1,000 who were massacred in Syria amid one of the worst atrocities since Assad's ousting. And this was shocking news, but also, we did hear that it was going to be more unstable after Assad because more extremists were taking over. and that has led to so much instability. And what led to this incident specifically was an Assad sympathizer, I believe, attacked or shot at the current some members of the new regime that is there. And in response, there was a massive death casualty event. And so Christians, among other religious minorities, the Alawites, I believe I'm saying that correctly, have been killed since last Thursday. There was 1,000 of them. It's just an increase in violence in the region. And out of the ones that we know who are dead, what's been reported by the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights is that 745 were civilians. So these aren't secured forces or militants. These are actual civilians. And in one specific case, over 60 civilians were lined up and just killed. And this is horrible news. It's horrific. It's shocking. So Liberty, I wanted to make sure we talk about it because it's not getting coverage nationally the way it should. So I'd like to get your thoughts, Liberty, and your reaction.
Yeah, I think it's, the biggest thing is just a reminder and a call for us to pray right now for persecuted Christians and others as well, persecuted religious minorities around the world. And it always puts things into perspective. And we fight against injustice here in the United States. And we fight to protect our rights to religious freedom, as you know, Chelsey, and so many other rights that we often take for granted. But we can't take those for granted, and we have to just acknowledge how blessed we are here, because around the world, this is what so many people are facing. And when there is unrest and upheaval, especially in nations that are not led by Christian principles or Christian founding in their history, then it is the minorities that suffer. It is the religious minorities, oftentimes Christians, and just, the courage and the bravery that they have to get up every day knowing that they might be targeted for their beliefs is just very convicting. So I'm glad you highlighted this because it's so important for us to be aware of.
We need to be aware of it, as you mentioned, so that we can be praying for our brothers and sisters in Christ, but also for unbelievers worldwide who are facing religious and ethnic cleansing and persecution, which is what they're beginning to call this, because specifically the Alawites in Syria were very close to the Assad administration. And so they were his supporters and backers. Even one of the territories that's been under attack by the new leadership there is predominantly from the Alawites, which is a sect of it's a Muslim sect. But as you mentioned, Christians are getting caught up in this as well. We also saw, the horrific situation, I believe it was out of Congo, where entire church was slaughtered there. And we're seeing these increases of martyrdom around the world, which we know will happen. And we know the Bible talks about increases in wars and rumors of wars, but also martyrdom especially in the end times. But it's so terrible to see. One really harrowing thing that I did see was in the midst of all of this, there's videos of people posting online from Syria saying, "Come help us. The world should see what's happening here." They're bringing in more and more military. You can call them military, but they're really terrorists coming into the homes and just killing whole entire families. And it's horrific. And the West has been largely silent. But one harrowing thing I saw there is in the streets, several Christians were carrying giant crosses, almost, I would say like 6-7 foot tall crosses, knowing that because of their Christian beliefs, they could be martyred in that instance, but they're still so faithful and understand that their hope is not in this world. And I thought that was so brave. Liberty, did you see any of that footage?
Yes, I did. And just, as you were talking about and other, recent memory, learning about church attacks, entire congregations being killed, or, Christians being targeted whenever there is upheaval in their home countries, like, we're seeing in Syria right now, just, the courage to be a Christian in public, to go to church, to take your family to church, to pray in public. And then as these brave Christians are doing in the midst of religious persecution, just declaring that I am a Christian and this is what I believe, and we're not going to hide that fact. It's so convicting because, again, that's not a reality that I think a lot of Western Christians and especially American Christians, we're just not very familiar with that. But if this doesn't convict you to, take a bold stand for your own faith here in America, it certainly has convicted me. But yeah, you see these stories of bravery, and we just, I'm so thankful to the Lord that He gives His people that kind of courage in those times, because that's what we're seeing right now.
Yes, I'm with you. I wish that this was being covered more. I think it's huge. We hear enough of Ukraine. We hear enough of Russia. We know what's going on in Israel and Gaza. And then for these human rights violations, these horrific events to go completely uncovered for me is terrible. And the fact that we need to hear President Trump coming against the Syrian leadership for this, the new interim president for this, and the terrorist groups, that there should be a call to action for human rights violations of this proportion. And I just wonder why there isn't more coverage of it. One thing to note as well is during the fighting, so the Christians and the Alawites are fleeing, obviously trying to leave Syria, which makes them refugees. And it's difficult for them to either get out or know where to go. And some of them are ending up, there's a Russian military base in Syria, which just makes us all feel warm and fuzzy, I know, but they are accepting these refugees.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're able to get there, which will hopefully launch them, out of the country, I hope. And then U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio did condemn the attack by radical Islamic terrorists and express solidarity with Syria's religious and ethnic minorities, urging the interim government to protect minorities and civilians. While he said that, less than an hour ago, I just got breaking news, Liberty, that Syria's interim president, I'm going to try to say his name correctly here. It is Ahmed al-Shara is the country's interim president. They've just committed to repealing the Syrian constitution and replacing it with Islamic rule of law. So that's most recent news out of Syria. Liberty, thoughts on that?
Things aren't going to get better. That's for sure. And this is where, again, I know that there are a lot of changes happening in Washington, D.C., but if the United States can be on anybody's side around the world, I know many people are America first, and I understand that, but can we support religious minorities and our persecuted brothers and sisters in Christ around the world who are, in fear for their lives? And so, yeah, I want to see more response from our government as well.
Absolutely. We can protect our U.S. interests. We can walk and chew gum at the same time and support Israel and pull out of Ukraine, which has been an inflated money laundering scheme, in my personal opinion, while trying to protect and stand up for these injustices across the world. Don't go anywhere. More political news right after this, and Alyssa will be joining us in just a few minutes.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult. And that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this.
I really appreciate your program. I don't get to listen to it every day because I have to work, but it's a really a blessing to me and to all of us.
Everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
I do appreciate Point of View and what you folks are doing. You really are doing a great job to educate and to help Christian folks do a better job to honor Christ in all that we do.
I just appreciate all you guys do. I mean, I learned so much, and it's amazing what you teach that I say to other people, and they look at me like, where did you hear that? So I appreciate you guys. So thank you for all you do.
I just turned your program on, and I want to just let you know how much I appreciate just getting the truth out.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now your host for the Millennial Roundtable, Chelsey Youman.
Well, welcome back to our second hour of Point of View, the Millennial Roundtable today. We are continuing on with Liberty McArtor, but joining us this hour is Alyssa Sonnenburg. She's the executive assistant, host, writer, and manager of the Self-Evident podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today, Alyssa.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
We're excited to have you back. We have a ton to cover today. In the last hour, we discussed news out of the IVF policy world, where Liberty and I broke down some ethical considerations there. We also talked about what's going on in Syria and some guidance that Liberty did such a great job helping us on deciphering the difference between education and information and propaganda or indoctrination, which is a topic we love to discuss on this show. So go back to the last hour on pointofview.net and listen, or Point of View Radio on Facebook, where you can like us, listen, leave comments. But we are turning now to some political news around the world. There's so much to cover, but we're going to start with Israel, because things are moving quickly in the war and the challenges between Israel and Hamas, and the ceasefire that's attempting to be negotiated is what I'll say there. As a little bit of background, Arab leaders from the entire region have been meeting in Qatar to negotiate with Israel, the Arab states, and Hamas on what a potential ceasefire could look like. Israel is looking to have a 2-month ceasefire and have half of the hostages returned. And after that 2 months, Israel has been adamant, as any, I think, sovereign nation would be, that they want to eradicate the terrorists in their backyard. They want to eradicate Hamas and the militant uprising that occurred, and ensure that they're secure and that doesn't happen again. Hamas is looking for a full cessation of all quote unquote hostilities, of course, because they're losing now. So, they want to wave the white flag now. In the midst of all of this, you guys remember, I don't know if you guys watched it live or on the news, when President Trump was in the middle of a press conference in Europe. It was one of the most, I think, iconic political moments or diplomatic moments of all time. My jaw hit the floor. And he said, "We are going to take over Gaza, and it's going to be beautiful. We're going to rebuild it. We're going to safely get the people out, so that we can, one, there's a lot of bombs that are hidden. I don't know if you can technically call them mines, but the similar concept throughout the entire region. It's not only unlivable. The people that are living there, there's 2 million residents, are living in tents. They're having a hard time getting aid in and out because Hamas keeps taking the aid, are some of the reports there from the ground. And so President Trump in this moment shocked the world by saying the U.S. is just essentially going to take over the region and do what they haven't been able to do there in years. And that transpired into a whole host of political discussions, which I think has led to this Arab negotiation that Egypt is leading the charge on, hasn't it? I'm going to start with you, Alyssa.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, ever since 1994, when Gaza was given to Palestine, they have been essentially living in what you were describing. They're living in tents. They're living in horrible conditions. And that kind of related to one of the things that has been being talked about in Israel as a possible reason for a possibility that would cause a ceasefire, even a way to end the war in Gaza. And 73% of Jews in Israel
actually see removing Palestinians entirely from that region as a very real possibility. One of the caucus co-chairmen of Israel, his name is Simcha Rothman. I hope I'm saying that correctly. And he's a lawmaker in Israel's governing coalition. And he told the NPR that getting the population out of there because they are in grave danger when they stay there, and they pose a grave danger to us when they are there, it makes sense. So we see that most Israeli Jews in that region desire to see that land kind of refurbished into what it used to be and given, a revamp, so to speak.
Yes, that is what they're describing, is removing the population. Of course, that was met with significant backlash, Liberty, on whether or not, I'm not going to use the propaganda terms because I don't think they're fair, but what you essentially have is a refugee crisis in Gaza where there are 2 million civilians in a really unsafe, uninhabitable space. Not only what do we do with them, we've got to clean out the space, make it safe, make sure there's not bombs, eradicate Hamas is one of the goals that Israel has. And then the question would be moving, I guess, the population back in after reconstruction. Egypt and Jordan, our major allies in the region, soundly rejected that proposal. And so as recently as today and yesterday, President Trump said, look, I'm not going to push that as an issue. It was a solution I proposed to get us talking about what are we going to do with this area of land, right, Liberty?
Right. And I understand people's hesitance when you talk about essentially, and I know that some have said, well, it could be an optional, move, but and a lot of people are talking about forcibly having the residents of the Gaza Strip moved. And so obviously that comes with a lot of connotations of whether or not that's right. But Hamas is the issue because even for the innocent civilians who live there, their lives are being made miserable by Hamas. And so it's complicated, and it has been for centuries, for millennia. And so just this issue over this area of the world. And so that's the core of it. And so I do think it was interesting when Trump proposed that, since he and his administration are advocating more of a isolationist, view when it comes to our foreign relations and foreign affairs and how we're going to be involved in the world. And then, well, let's just go ahead and, take over Gaza Strip. I don't know how realistic that was, but Trump does tend to make these grandiose statements in order to get a conversation going or to get people to start acting. And so hopefully we will see some progress with different leaders from around the region trying to work together on a solution, even if it's not that one, which I don't think is realistic or even desirable for the U.S. to get involved in. But hopefully they will come up with a solution that results in Hamas being defeated.
Yes, I do want to say that it's important to distinguish between, getting out of a war, a never-ending war in Ukraine that's over a territorial battle with Russia that's been on and off for decades, and supporting our deep and close ally, Israel. There's a lot of American interest in stability in the Middle East and in that region, particularly with as aggressive and hostile as Iran has become. Syria, we discussed in the last hour how unstable Syria is in the region. We do have some allies there by way of Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, but we also need to protect Israel at all costs. And my first reaction when I heard President Trump make that statement is Gaza is not ours. Gaza is Israel's. God, we know the God of the Bible has assigned that land completely and entirely to Israel. But how we get there matters, of course. And I did want to just flag that the Arab leaders have agreed on a $53 million reconstruction proposal for the Gaza Strip. But the U.S. has rejected that because it doesn't include making it militarily safe, or, as we've discussed, the need to eradicate Hamas from the region, who, you raise an important point, Liberty, that they've used their own Palestinian civilians as human shields and had a whole host of crimes. More when we get back after this short break.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Natasha Crane warns Christians in her new book, When Culture Hates You, Persevering for the Common Good as Christians in a Hostile Public Square. She begins by talking about the hostility Christians often face when they articulate a biblical perspective on cultural issues. Now, we shouldn't be surprised, since Jesus warned us that if the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. One of the most significant criticisms from non-Christians, and even from Christians as well, is that Christians should not impose their views on others. We also hear that Christians should not seek power. We're told that getting involved in politics harms our witness and can disrupt unity in the church. And we're told that Christians should not be partisans. Well, to evaluate those objections, she proposes slavery as a test case. Here are her 5 key statements using those objections. Number 1, Christians shouldn't have worked to end slavery because we shouldn't have imposed our views on others. Number 2, Christians shouldn't have worked to end slavery because that involves seeking power to do it. Number 3, Christians shouldn't have worked to end slavery because getting involved with a political issue harmed our witness. Number 4, Christians shouldn't have worked to end slavery because it disrupted unity in the church. And number 5, Christians shouldn't have worked to end slavery because Christians shouldn't have been partisans. Now, would we accept those objections today? We should reject such reasoning and can see how we shouldn't have applied such arguments 2 centuries ago. We were called to speak truth then, and we're called to speak truth today. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, welcome back to the Millennial Roundtable, where I am joined by Liberty McArtor and Alyssa Sonnenburg today. We are turning our discussion to what has become, I think, the biggest First Amendment news of the new year, certainly the President Trump's new administration, and that is the arrest of Mahmoud Khalil. He is a Palestinian green card holder, and he was here in the United States on originally a student visa starting in 2012 to get his graduate degree at Columbia University. 10 years later, he married his American wife and received a green card. He has been detained by immigration officials. I want to say not arrested on federal charges or anything like that, but at an ICE detention center in Louisiana for being the orchestrator, essentially, of the pro-Palestinian protests at Columbia University. And he was also the chief negotiator between the students in Columbia University and President Trump's press secretary yesterday said one of the reasons he's being detained and probably deported, it looks like at this juncture, is because he disseminated pro-Hamas materials in those protests. And so there's going to be a lot here. We're going to break it down today. There's a lot of layers here to uncover. I'm just starting with some of the high-level facts or facts that we've been told. We're not being verified yet. Of course, he has representation. And Mr. Khalil has filed a lawsuit to enjoin or stop his deportation and say, he has a right to due process under the law before, even though he is a green card holder, before he is deported. And of course, in that lawsuit, they raised, First Amendment discrimination defenses against him. So we have a lot to talk about. Liberty, I would love for you just to break down for us your initial thoughts on this case that we're seeing unfold. I'll add just one note. As recently as in the last 2 hours, there were over 100 protesters arrested at Trump Tower in Manhattan, in New York, because this case is it's explosive, for lack of a better term. Not only are the pro-Palestinian or Hamas sympathizing, I don't even know what we can call them, protesters, those have been thousands and thousands across the United States for over years now, a year and a half, protesting. And so not only does it involve the hot topic issue of Palestine and Israel and Gaza, it also involves, in this case, them feeling that he's a political, essentially being arrested for political grounds against his First Amendment rights.
Yeah, I think it's new ground for a lot of people, Chelsey, because at least I know I'm not, an expert in how to apply the law to, people who are here legally but who are not citizens. And so this is, I was doing research on the article, and I'm sure that you can take us through more of the case history and kind of the, different Supreme Court precedents that there are. But it seems like it is complicated. And so we know that he is, a green card holder, so he's a legal permanent resident. And so he's not a U.S. citizen, and we know that based on my understanding of case precedent in the past, green card residents and people who are here legally but not as citizens, they can be deported if they show support for terrorist organizations. And so I think the question kind of comes down to, was he speaking in a way that is protected at all by the First Amendment, or is this political retaliation? And so, with those, the protests that were happening at the time, sparked at Columbia, but happened around the U.S. and around the world, we saw a lot of anti-Semitism. We saw violence against Jewish students. We did see outright support, not just for Palestinians, but for Hamas, the terrorist organization. And so, I think what it really boils down to is where did he land on those things? Was he inciting violence, or was he expressing a pro-Palestinian sentiment in protest, which I think, people should be allowed to do. And so we do want to address anti-Semitism and, take that very seriously. And so I'm glad if the Trump administration is doing that. But again, we do want to make sure that we foster an environment of protected free speech for people. And so it's complicated. I don't really know exactly what to think about it, Chelsey, but I'm interested to learn more.
Yes, we're going to break down the First Amendment implications because, we discuss so much the importance of nuance on the show, and that we don't want to have on blinders. Just because President Trump administration is acting doesn't mean that we are, have been lobotomized from critical thinking. And we, as if you are a conservative, value the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom to assemble, religious liberty, all those conscience protections are at the foundation and root of our Constitution and our very society. And so we're going to analyze that. Before we get there, I did want to see, Alyssa, your thoughts on this arrest or detainment, I'm going to say, because there's no criminal charges against him. It's immigration detainment. What were your initial thoughts when you heard about this situation?
I am personally pro his detainment. People like to call on free speech a lot. However, I can't run into a theater and yell fire and not have any charges laid against me for that. Free speech has a limit. And to Liberty's point, a legal permanent resident, or commonly known as a green card holder, can face arrest and deportation if they promote or encourage any kind of terrorist organization. And Hamas has been labeled as a terrorist organization. And so the toxic empathy people would like to say, well, what about his wife? What about his baby? And my question to them is, I understand, I'm due in June with me and my husband's first child. I can't imagine him, being taken away from me. But my biggest question is, why would he put his family in that position? Like Liberty said, he is not a U.S. citizen. His legal status here is based on the premise that he is going to be a good possible citizen, that he's going to follow the rules. And one of those basic rules being that you cannot promote terrorist organizations. In addition to that, he was actually under investigation at Columbia University for harassment of Jews and mass discrimination. So it's not as if this guy was just trying to be a little bit pro-Palestinian or tried to promote the idea of Palestine having more land or more freedoms. This guy was more radical than the left wants you to believe.
Mm-hmm. You're raising really important points for all of this. Let's break down, Alyssa, a little bit of the factors that you said. So we said he has not been charged with a crime, which would, by the way, also be grounds for deportation if he had been. And they have not alleged that he engaged in any legally prohibited activity against U.S. residents, which would have been another ground. There's one allegation listed and one that we heard yesterday that is a factor for these proceedings. One is he's being removed under the Immigration and Nationality Act that permits deportation of lawful residents if their presence presents a risk of potentially serious adverse foreign policy consequences. And so that's what was cited in the petition. And then the second is he can be removed if he's provided material support to a prescribed organization, which Hamas is. And so what we heard Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt say yesterday in the White House is that he was promoting and giving out materials with Hamas logos on them, and which would be Hamas propaganda. Hamas is a terrorist organization. So it's not, the situation where Candace Owens is kind of, there's a big divide among conservatives right now, which is why we're talking about this. Candace Owens is out there saying it was only a few months ago that pro-life religious people were considered domestic terrorists under the FBI and arrested by the dozens, by the way, under alleged FACE Act violations. We know they have a lot of domestic terrorist profiles for parents who show up to the school board meetings, not wanting their kids to be transitioned at school, gender transitioned. So we are in this situation where we have seen the federal government do what they're calling lawfare against populations and ideas they disagree with. I'm going to say that this needs to be a separate category because we're talking about Hamas. We're talking about a bona fide terrorist organization that recently and is still actively committing humanitarian crimes in Israel, and he is Palestinian, and so it's not too wild to surmise that there are populations and immigrants in our nation right now. We've seen an uptick in warnings about terrorist cells that have popped up. We had a terrorist attack in New Orleans recently. We had one in Las Vegas recently. And so this is under the category in the First Amendment world of a security risk. And so you are allowed to limit speech. It's not just this giant right without any limitations. The government is allowed to limit someone's free speech if it incites violence, if it is dangerous, if it prevents a security risk. I have seen land zone laws where they won't allow churches to meet or park in a neighborhood because the parking presents a traffic hazard. And that rises to the ability. There are standards here of what's necessity. It's an increased standard under the First Amendment, but it's not a wholesale right to do whatever you want in the United States of America. We're going to get more on this when we get back after this short break.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, Chelsey Youman.
Well, welcome back to the Millennial Roundtable, where we have discussed all sorts of world news today. Go to Point of View Radio on Facebook and like us, or watch us on pointofview.net. You can also go ahead and leave comments there. And we are turning now our discussion. We're talking about Mahmoud Khalil, who is the Columbia University student who is potentially getting deported that ICE has detained. And of course, I have Alyssa and Liberty on the show to break it down. We left the last segment talking about really a little bit of First Amendment analysis. And so I'll summarize it here, and I'd love to get both of your viewpoints on this. But of course, you have a First Amendment right to believe. It starts in your conscience, your religious views, whatever you want, and then to speak those rights, or the right to speak about your beliefs and viewpoints, your First Amendment rights of free speech. You have the right to assemble with others who are like-minded, like you could maybe perhaps in this protest that we're talking about that happened in Columbia, although it wasn't a typical protest. It really was a huge encampment and disruptive, and there were lots of anti-Semitic things that were done, crimes that were committed, people who were arrested. So this wasn't your mainstream protest, we've said, but you have a right to protest. And you also have a right to be in our country and not deported without going through the process. It's called due process of law. But there are parameters and limitations on those First Amendment rights. They're not unlimited. And so it's elevated protection, which means you have strict scrutiny in a court of law, which says the government can only limit those rights or constitutional rights if it's necessary to do so for compelling government interest. If there's a compelling interests are things like safety. Compelling interests are national security. Compelling interests can be, even in some of the cases I worked on, things like traffic flow. If it creates a hazard in the traffic, for instance, a Jewish synagogue I represented wasn't able to meet in the home because of a traffic problem that it created. And so when you think of your First Amendment rights, they are not completely uninhibitable. They just it has to arise for a compelling government interest, which I would argue in this current situation, there could be, because the White House mentioned that Mr. Khalil was distributing Hamas materials at these protests, which would be terrorist materials and terrorist propaganda. So go ahead and take it from here, Alyssa. I really want to get your breakdown.
Yeah, I completely agree with you and your legal analysis. Obviously, you are much more adept in that area than I am. But again, it's not as if this individual was simply peacefully protesting a Palestinian view on land in Israel or the war, because that is certainly covered under First Amendment right, but you really cross the line of legal boundary when you start promoting, or at least indirectly maybe promoting, terrorist organizations, as this individual was doing with passing out Hamas materials. And let's not forget that Hamas and Palestinians are not buddies, so to speak. If we remember back to the horrible attack on October 7 that Hamas unleashed on Israel, Israel gave the Gaza Strip due warning that they were going to counterstrike. And they told the Palestinians in that region that it's time for them as civilians to leave, to get out, because they were going to conduct a national strike on them. However, Hamas did not allow those Palestinians to leave. And of course, this painted Israel as this evil genocidal monster in the news. How dare they attack innocent civilians? And so we really need to keep our facts straight. We need to separate Palestine from Hamas, and promoting materials, passing out materials that promote Hamas really is not only damaging to your own side, but it's damaging to the safety of everyone involved.
Well said. Again, I did caveat this by saying we've lived under a Biden administration for 4 years where they called it lawfare, but it's really just arresting political enemies and using all the systems possible to attack your political opponents. And we want to distinguish, I think it's important to distinguish that, because a lot of commentators and conservatives are breaking with President Trump and his administration on this decision, like Candace Owens, Liberty, who is out here saying, we just saw the other side do this and we don't want to continue that type of efforts. I will also add that Candace Owens has become pretty anti-Israel. I got to be careful how I say this, but she is definitely no sympathizer to Israel at this juncture, and is sympathetic to Gaza. And she asks it's good to ask questions. We talked about this earlier, knowing the facts, education, what is going on in the Gaza Strip. Are there humanitarian crimes being committed? Or is it Hamas, which we've heard the reports from local Palestinians, Alyssa, what you're alluding to, that say it's Hamas that's blocking the aid, stealing the food, stealing from the Palestinian people any type of humanitarian aid that's been able to get in. And so I know I'm throwing a lot at you, Liberty, but I would like to hear your thoughts on this dichotomy. You know, all of a sudden the liberals are remembering that they love First Amendment constitutional freedoms.
Yes.
But we don't want to be, you don't want to be hypocritical. We want to be objective in analyzing this. And I'd love to get your thoughts on that. Is there a hypocrisy here? Can we distinguish between promoting a terrorist or, what could have been promoting a terrorist Hamas materials, is what the White House said yesterday.
Mm-hmm. And I do appreciate your analysis and Alyssa's comments as well, because, again, this is something that I think for a lot of people, it's like, what do I think about this? And with regard to the comments from Candace Owens that you made, I will say, if we were seeing the Trump administration, or if we eventually see the Trump administration start targeting American citizens, and saying, you're a terrorist organization because you have different political beliefs than me, that would be a big problem. Right. But I don't think there is any equating between what was happening with the Biden administration and, calling pro-lifers or concerned school parents terrorists, and then an actual terrorist organization like Hamas, which everybody, reasonable recognizes as a terrorist organization. So this is where it's really important just to, like we were talking about earlier, think through it. It's okay to not know for sure, but then say, okay, I'm going to dig into the facts. And what I think we have to be really careful too is the whataboutism. Like, well, what about when they did this? And that can either be used to justify, well, now, so we're going to do this because they did it. Or it can be justified to say, well, I don't think we should do this because it looks like when they did this. And sometimes it's not comparing apples to apples, like in this situation. Again, if Khalil was a citizen, then it would be, I think, a lot different. But since he is technically an alien, and if it's true that he was passing out, pro-Hamas materials, then that means that he's violating the rules, as I understand them and as you've explained, of being in the U.S. legally, which is to not promote a terrorist organization. And so, if those are the facts, then it's more understandable, because we're living in a time where we can't mess around with terrorists, and we are seeing so many terrorist attacks around the world, and even in the United States. And so, if again, and Alyssa was right to delineate between Palestinians and Hamas, which I think the media has not always helped with that. And that's what I think a lot of young people have kind of gotten caught up in without really understanding the distinction there.
That's a really good point. But I'm going to hone in on a key word you said. You repeat this a few times, Liberty. You said, if those are the facts. So I'm going to push here a little bit on President Trump's administration from a PR perspective, not a political commentary here. But this is the second time in, I'm going to say 3 weeks, that I have seen the Trump administration, I would say, misstep on the PR side of things. Like, if the facts are true, that he was submitting Hamas materials to people at these protests, which would be providing material support to a terrorist organization, definitive grounds for deportation under the law. They should have provided those receipts and been very clear about that and said, these are the types of materials, or given details to the American people so that we can squash the question in anybody's minds about whether he can be lawfully deported. You lead with that from a PR perspective. The first time they did this was with, and this might not have been their fault, but with Pam Bondi at the DOJ. She's the new attorney general. When she said, I'm going to release all the Epstein documents, we're going to just release it all, transparency for weeks. I think they gave too much of a timeline on that because it gave the public grounds to say, well, where are these documents? And then when they couldn't get all the documents from the FBI because the FBI was burning the documents in New York City, and there was a disconnect there, then they only released like what was already been given to the public, and there was so much redaction. There was no new information. I think that was a PR nightmare because what it's led to is this it's led us to question the administration on how serious they are about transparency. And they should have been, I think, if you're going to release documents, say it in real time. Give the receipt so the public can know exactly what's going on. That's my 2 cents. More when we get back after this short break.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back. Alyssa, Liberty, and I are rounding out our discussion on Mr. Khalil, the Palestinian or potentially pro-Hamas. We haven't seen the proof yet. Protester from Columbia University, one of the leaders of that protest, where he is arrested and potentially going to be deported. So I just wanted to round out our commentary. Alyssa, your thoughts on what I said about President Trump's administration maybe doing a cleaner job on the transparency side of things, as they're moving very quickly, and it's a lot for the American public to digest just how much they're doing all day, every day. The media certainly can't and is not covering it all. And that's not to say that the media is going to do a fair job by President Trump, but I think there have been a couple moments in the last few weeks where we as the American public were told one thing and expected one thing. The release of the Epstein documents is a great example. Or yesterday that Mr. Khalil was distributing pro-Hamas materials, but without really the follow through, and it doesn't lend, in my personal opinion, towards confidence. It raises an eyebrow, is what I'll say. So, Alyssa, I'd love to get your thoughts on that, and feel free to push back if you think I'm wrong.
No, I completely agree with you. You hit the nail on the head. That I think the reason why we're seeing so much division in even conservative circles, like you mentioned, Candace Owens and other sides saying different things, is because there's a lack of clarity. Even when I was researching this individual, it was hard to find hard facts, hard evidence. What was he actually doing? Was he a good student at Columbia University? All of these things. It was very hard to find any good hard evidence. So, of course, when you have a lack of clarity, a lack of transparency very quickly when it comes in the public eye, you, of course, are going to garner a lot of confusion, a lot of division. I completely agree with you.
Yes, and there were other protesters who were arrested and had committed crimes that were not U.S. citizens. And so, that perhaps, I think it has been said by the President Trump's administration, there will be more arrests. Liberty, any thoughts on the PR side of this?
You always want to lead with the evidence that you have, and that especially your political opponents are going to come after you and push back. And when even your political allies are pushing back, I think you're totally right. You got to lead with your strongest evidence and your strongest arguments. And if you're going to come out with a bold claim or action, don't leave any ambiguity as to why you're doing so.
I think you're right. I would still like to see those Epstein documents. I know that there's difficulty between Pam Bondi over at the DOJ and the FBI getting a hold of those documents. But it just, like I said, it just doesn't lend towards confidence now on what is in those documents, and it leads to too many questions. And so maybe they could make the announcement closer in real time. They also gave those documents to a lot of influencers or who call themselves independent journalists. I understand wanting to broaden the tent, so to speak, on the media and who's in the room, but that also ended up being kind of a debacle. And so just interesting thoughts from, how things are being handled. But certainly, as I mentioned, there's so much to discuss and unpack almost daily now. We're going to touch in our last few minutes on, we're not going to unpack the entire Russia-Ukraine war in 10 minutes, but there are historic peace negotiations underway literally right now as we speak. So we're going to discuss the fact that we all saw what happened with Vice President Vance and President Trump and the Ukrainian president he was kicked out. Zelensky was kicked out of the White House, then came back to the table after his very public spanking, and has done everything that we originally had set forth as America that we wanted him to do diplomatically. So the peace talks are underway. President Zelensky has agreed to the peace discussions. Included in those is the inclusion that the U.S. will continue to provide forces and military support to the region, which I had a question about that, ladies. I thought that looked a little bit, we're pushing for peace talks, and President Putin has been very clear he wants long-standing peace in the region, and he probably wants that territory, the 4 territories he's occupied or is trying to occupy. But I think it almost cuts against the peace deal if it looks like we're continuing to send military over. That President, do we think President Putin's likely to sign it? Do we think he's trustworthy? Liberty, I'll start with you.
Well, I think we're talking about the same peace deal, but I saw a headline just a few minutes ago that he's already rejected it. So
well, there goes.
I would say no. But yeah, the whole thing is a little bit, it's hard because you're not going to find a deal, I don't think, where we can fully trust President Putin. Understandably, he's a dictator. But how can we placate him enough to where Ukraine gets enough of what it wants and the U.S. gets what we want and still keep our national security interest at the forefront? So, that's what they're trying to negotiate right now. But more U.S. troops in Ukraine, I don't think that's going to be very popular.
Yeah, as you mentioned, it's such a complex geopolitical war. A little bit of background, Alyssa, that you recall is that part of what President Putin says was the beginning of his invasion of Ukraine was Ukraine's efforts. It's that western border of Russia to Europe. It's a really important border. It's why Germany and Poland and everybody's highly concerned about the territorial grab on behalf of Russia, is that Ukraine was wanting to join NATO. And that was viewed as a security threat. And so I think Putin has been very clear about his interests, Alyssa. He wants the territory. He wants Ukraine not to be a part of NATO, which they're determined to do. NATO is determined to continue increasing military spend, which is good, to increase their defenses. And Russia, by the way, I read in one quarter, in a 3-month period, is able to produce more military than the EU in a year combined does, because they've spent so much on it. It's why they can have military bases in Syria. Don't forget that they're backing the proxy wars. Russia is backing the proxy wars in the Middle East. That appears they don't have economic power or even population power, but they have expended a lot on their military capabilities. Thoughts, Alyssa?
Yeah, absolutely. This big question of can Putin be trusted, you hit the nail on the head that, Putin has been, for all his faults, he is an evil dictator, but for all his faults, he has been very honest about what his interests are with Russia, what he would like to see on the table. And so, again, this big question, can he be trusted? Ultimately, leaders like Putin can never be trusted, ultimately, to keep their word. They don't have that kind of reputation. They wouldn't be where they are today if they had that kind of reputation. But this is why a Trump administration is so timely and so necessary, because if we think back to Trump's first administration in 2016, we saw that Russia really stayed in line. And that's not because Putin is such a great guy or he kept his word, et cetera, et cetera. It's because Trump has made America's position very clear that he is not to be messed with and that there will be repercussions when lines are drawn and lines are crossed. I think of Teddy Roosevelt's famous phrase, speak softly and carry a big stick. And that is exactly what the Trump administration is embodying. And Trump makes that very clear when it comes to global economics, when it comes to global affairs, when it comes to these wars, that he intends to make sure that America's word means something. So whatever peace deal is struck, whether one happens in the future or not, it will be based on the fact that America means what it says.
Yes, I like what you're alluding to. And if you remember the Tucker Carlson interview, which I watched with President Putin over in Russia, I mean, it was the most insight we've ever had into who this person is. And if you recall, the U.S. and Russia weren't always, they have always been on bad terms, but he used to come down to Crawford Ranch with President Bush. They were very close. He would go to Camp David, and that there was at least a connection there that maybe President Trump can bring about again. Alyssa, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you, Liberty, for joining us as always. Don't forget to go to pointofview.net, read our articles today. I'm Chelsey Youman, and it's been a pleasure to be with you. Have a great afternoon.
If you appreciate the trustworthy news and biblical worldview that you hear on Point of View, would you consider joining our team, the Truth Team? Listeners like you have been the backbone of Point of View for 53 years. But today there are more voices competing for Americans' attention than ever before, and few of them are anchored to biblical truth. By joining Point of View's Truth Team, you can be an integral part of keeping truth on the air. In just a few weeks, Point of View will celebrate Truth Team Week. But you don't have to wait till then. You can join the Truth Team right now and help us get a head start on our $150,000 spring fundraising goal. If you appreciate Point of View, please join the Truth Team. Join today by visiting us online at pointofview.net. Or you can call toll-free 1-800-347-5151. pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
Thank you, Kirby. I really appreciate your program. You cover a lot of issues that a lot of us think about, I'm sure. And this is the first time I've ever called in, so I appreciate your input, too.
Oh, I thank God for what you're doing on Point of View. You guys have more influence across this country than I believe any of them in terms of tackling the issues and getting the truth out to Americans. It's getting to the point where truth just is bottled up on every hand. Every time you turn around, there's another big bottleneck against truth. I hope your listeners realize what Point of View is doing and supports Point of View in every possible way you can.
You know, I can't go to Washington. I can't do those things, so the only way that I can help is the way that God has provided for me, and to give some of that back to you guys. So, like you said, partnering with Point of View, because, you know, you can't do it alone. Thank you very much for what you guys do. Believe me, it's a needed thing, and I just hope everybody certainly would get on the bandwagon with you.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.